So hello everybody, welcome to Cybersalon. Thank you very much for joining us. Cybersalon is a digital futures think tank. We mainly preoccupied with researching new technology and making sure that they are safe for society to consume. But we are also technologists, we also build and we in cybersecurity, so we kind of sit on the fence, not just theorizing, but also very much building. And today event has been put together by a number of people involved in facial recognition in the city, a topic that we've been working on for a long time. So you see some posters behind me. Cybersalon has been researching smart cities all the way back from 2013. And things are getting more and more hairy, but also more and more useful. So as always, the future is not always meant to be, but it's much more interesting. So the plan today, if you guys can introduce yourselves, so I give a couple of minutes to each, and then we will go to everybody for a few minutes to tell us about your products and your research. And then we have a discussion. So please send Q&A, send questions, and no hackling in the back. Okay, so can I start the introduction? So Angus, could you please introduce yourself?
Certainly. My name's Gus Fraser. I have been in the industry in many forms for many years. I have a couple of interesting things that I do outside of my day job. My day job is consulting, but outside of that, I'm building autonomous drones to go and find people who fall off ships. I am building monitors to determine who's wearing a mask and who isn't, and something special for bird strikes at airports. So lots of interesting things.
Yes, Gus, I have to say, is a very good friend of mine, and he is always not just on the cutting edge of tech, but he is the definition of the cutting edge. You can hear the blades running. So if Gus is not doing it, it's not worth doing. Okay, so can we go to Stephanie Hare?
Hi, everybody. I am an independent researcher and broadcaster, and I'm working on a book that will be out next year called Technology Ethics. So I'm trying to think about the different ways that we can create and use technology so that it maximizes benefits and minimizes harm. And facial recognition technology is one of the case studies that I've been exploring. So I'm very happy to be here with you all and keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, delighted you could make here. You have a very varied background, all the way from Palantir to Accenture to Oxford Analytica, not Cambridge Analytica,
yeah.
Oxford Analytica, the good guys. So hopefully we can hear all about it. So great, fantastic that you could make it. And then Satinder, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, hi, I'm Satinder Gill, and so I'm with the AI and Society Journal of Knowledge, Culture and Communication. It's a wonderful journal. It's been running since the mid-1980s, and it is probably one of the few journals that has a completely cross-disciplinary and cross-cultural perspective on both the use, purposes and future of technology in society. And it ranges. We embrace various different perspectives and ways of speaking about it. So we don't streamline and we don't require people to speak in certain ways. But I think that what many who work with the journal and write with the journal, they're very passionate about purpose for society, the future of society. So it's great to be here and I look forward to the discussion.
And I just found an event, Satinder, to which you ran back in 2013 on Reclaim AI, Back to the Human.
Yes,
Satinder has been on AI barricades for a long time. Except that the AI is making twists and turns and it always goes somewhere else where we don't expect it to go. So yes, so Edward, can you tell us a few things about yourself?
Yes, well, I should say by way of disclaimer, neither a lawyer nor a coder, but I've worked for many years at the intersection of policy, technology, and practice in travel. I spent about 15 years in the airline reservations industry, particularly as a subject matter expert working with programmers who were developing expert systems and business process automation to interface with reservations. In the early days, the online travel agency business. Started writing as a industry insider, as a travel journalist and consumer advocate, and began looking increasingly at privacy with respect to travel as a consumer issue. And then after 9/11, as governments began trying to root into the travel industry, even before they started rooting into the telecoms, I was approached and began working increasingly with civil liberties and human rights groups that wanted to understand what this data was that the governments were pursuing and how they might use it. And since 2006, I've been a consultant to the Identity Project, which is a civil liberties project focused specifically on freedom of movement and travel. And although I'm an American, as you probably can tell, I say privacy rather than privacy. I have been very involved in the debate over the years, particularly at the European Parliament, on control of access to and sharing of travel-related data, as well as having some engagement with other international bodies, particularly ICAO, which we may talk about a bit later.
Thank you very much. So we have a good spread of points of view and lenses. And I think we also have online Derek Alton from Canada, who I'm hoping to bring later, because Canada and Toronto seem to be emerging on the cutting edge of what not to do. So I'm sure we can cover it in more detail. But without further ado, I think we want to see what the products around are like. And we've got Gus, and then I will talk about another startup from DataSpark. But I think, Gus, if you can talk about what you've been creating and wonderful uses of AI and image recognition you've been experimenting with, that would be a great start. You're on mute. Can you just unmute?
There we go. That's much better. I didn't want noise in the room to be distracting anyone. So this all started with me being in, believe it or not, a TK Maxx in the UK, and being astounded at the number of people who, given that we have the approach to mask wearing in the UK is fundamentally different than it is in the US, in that the government are saying that if you're in a store, you have to wear a mask. And the challenge has always been that no one's actually prepared to challenge anyone. So I decided to carry out an interesting social experiment. I got my vape out and started vaping in the store. And sure enough, within 2 seconds, people approached me. And so there's a psychological difference between someone smoking a vape in a store and someone not wearing a mask. It's debatable which one's more likely to kill you, but I think I know where I apportion the risk. So I thought, well, you know, there's got to be a better way. And the answer I got back from the person in the store was, we don't feel empowered to be able to challenge people, or we feel that we're going to get an argument back from people. And I thought, well, maybe there's a thing that technology can do here, right? So you can't argue with a machine, because it's an argument you're actually going to lose, because the machine is dispassionate, it doesn't care. It's just stating the fact that you either are or you either aren't wearing a mask. And so I wanted to see how I could do this on cheapest chips hardware for no money, very, very cheap, almost a throwaway piece of technology that people could use during the pandemic. And here's one I built earlier. I have to put a shade over it, unfortunately. So I have to put a shade over it because otherwise it tells me constantly to be wearing a mask. And so there's a nice friendly little thing there. In fact, if I bring Eva up, hopefully it will tell Eva to wear a mask. Is it going to see you, Eva? Please wear a face mask. There you go. And Eva, if you put a face, do you have a face mask with you?
Possibly.
If you don't, I have one here. Don't worry, I shall shove one on for you, because who knows what goes on in my house, right? So I'm now wearing one, and so thank you for wearing a face mask. So it's thanking me for wearing a face mask. So Wearing a face mask. Yeah, okay, I got it. Thanks very much. He's wearing a face mask. This is why I have to cover the camera, because now it's going to sit there and just bitch at me all evening. So what that is basically a very basic Raspberry Pi with a TensorFlow model on, and it really took 3 days to put together. There's an amazing number of images out there of people in masks, and there's an amazing number of images of people out there without masks. And very interestingly, bias wasn't so much of an issue because it's a global pandemic. I was able to gather images from all continents, all races, all skin tones. And so I made it a very nice representative data set. I think I ended up with somewhere in a region of around about 30,000 images for both. And so training the model and writing the code to actually build the device was trivial. I think it's less than 130 lines of code. But building the model to be able to accurately spot people, and it spots things like this. It's reasonably good at the nose, determining the nose wearers, but it depends on how close you are. So it's actually quite good. I've deployed it in my daughter's school, which is interesting because she now gets to hear my disembodied voice telling everyone in the school to wear a mask. And so, we're trialing it, and if it works out, then we'll start to deploy it in retail stores and see what happens. Now, interestingly, in the server as well, just for giggles, we put a web server in, so it monitors footfall, and out of that footfall at any given time, it can show you the numbers of people who were wearing masks and who weren't over a week, a month, a day. So you can see how effective you're being. My anticipation is that post-pandemic, I'm going to repurpose the devices remotely to just purely measure footfall coming in and out of the location, so I can tell you how many men, how many women, roughly break them down by age. Let's see what we can do with the model. But that's basically what I've built. I don't store any data because I don't need to store the data as far as images go. I don't want to store the data as far as the images go because I think that's an invasion of people's privacy. I think letting them know that they are or aren't wearing a mask is enough. I don't need the images. I don't want the images. I don't want to connect to the outside world to report anybody for not wearing a mask. I just want that point of contact to be, please could you wear a mask, because you're going to be saving other people's lives. So that's what I built. I look forward to any questions later on, unless there are any right now.
I think it's lots of questions, but let's run through the other products. So Ben, can you pull up the AI bar, guys, because John can't make it, so I will do the honors. So we have a little video to show another AI for good as it is described. Let's just hope that it will play. Sound is actually not particularly relevant. It's just to see. If you put your, you can see the face recognition. It's a bar product. So John is just talking about it. So you go to the bar, and instead of the queuing, you just show up, and the AI recognizes your face, and it can then give you the number in the queue, and it gives the barman the line of who is first, who is second, who is third, so you don't have to panic. You're not going to miss your spots in your pint. And they were also looking at, this is not a data collection, so this is deleted pretty much after, I think, every 15 minutes. So the purpose of it was to make queuing in the bar less strenuous rather than a data collection. So John, who has programmed it, is from DataSpark, which is actually quite big AI company. They looking at implementation. They have implemented a couple of bars just before COVID. So we don't have any further real life data, but the assumption was that in busy bars, it is unpleasant experience to queue and trying to catch the eyes of the barman. So it struck us as a quite of interesting use of AI. And again, similar to Gus, it was quite straightforward training process. It doesn't need to know anything about the actual people, it just needs to know the sequence. So those were the two projects that we came across recently, the kind of space of AI for good, I guess. But there is more, and there's also a lot more in the space of AI for not so good. So I think that might be then good time to bring Ed Hasbrouck, who has been researching on face recognition in airports, plus many other biometric topics and surveillance in airports. So what's your take on the situation?
Well, at this point, if we could maybe have the first of those illustrations up. The industry and government consensus is already that facial recognition will be universally used throughout air travel at every touch point in the system. This is not a consensus in which civil society or privacy or human rights advocates had any role. But the other illustration, if you could, Ben. We'll come back to this one. Well, since we've got this up, let me just say, where are we here? Yeah, here we are. So this is the industry vision from IATA, which is the airline consortium, but I've heard the same thing, and I could show you exactly the same from governments, that at every stage of your journey, you will be identified by facial recognition, and that will be used in a combined, fully integrated way by both the industry side and the government side, which includes airlines on the industry side. It includes governments, police agencies, border control, as well as domestic police. And it includes airports, which are in a curious place in the middle, because in some places in the US, all the passenger airlines, airports are operated by state and local governments. In the UK and some other places, you have airports that have been privatized. So is the airport a private or a government actor? Most people can't tell. I doubt that most of you could tell when you're passing through an airport who is really in control. And you'll notice that this relies on and it is planned to rely on a fully integrated infrastructure. Unfortunately, this consensus arises out of a malign convergence of interest, which has been driving these developments for many years, a convergence of interest between industry's desire to track people for business process automation and marketing purposes, personalization, and government's desire to track them for surveillance and control purposes. And after 9/11, there was some butting of heads between industry and government for a while when the governments tried to dragoon the industry into functioning as an outsourced surveillance agent for the state in terms of travel. But over the 20 years since, they've realized how closely aligned their interests are, and the development of this integrated plan for common use surveillance and control technology that the industry can use, but where the government is fully built in from the start with respect to facial recognition at every stage, is where it goes. The working methodology, as it's been deployed, at least in the US, is that the Department of Homeland Security provides what it calls an Identity as a Service API, the Traveler Verification Service, which is accessible to government agencies, to airports, and to airlines, and potentially to other contractors, where they can submit a photo through various apps that talk to this DHS API. They submit a photo. And when they submit the photo, several things happen. One is that the photo is added to the DHS gallery of photos that's stored in the permanent history for this traveler if they're not a US citizen. They claim that if they're a US citizen, it'll be deleted, but there's no transparency or enforcement mechanism, so we can't rely on that. But more importantly, regardless of whether the photo is added to the permanent file to build out the dossier of photos in different settings and contexts that the government has about this traveler, but the incident is logged. And there's a lot of focus, I think, on whether the photos are retained, but actually what matters much less than whether the photo is retained is whether the incident is logged. And I think there's an analogy there in automated license plate readers. In the US, most people, when they travel, they're not walking, or taking public transit. Most people in America, when they travel, they drive. So in many ways, automated license plate recognition rather than automated facial recognition is how you recognize an American who's moving about, because they're in their car. And it doesn't really matter whether you keep the pictures of the license plate any more than whether you keep the pictures of the person. What matters is that the instance where the license plate or the photo is spotted are logged and go into a permanent travel history dossier. And this, even for US citizens where supposedly the photo isn't kept at the airport, the incident is logged. And again, going back to that earlier illustration, that is each time any of these actors, the airport, the airline, the government itself, at a border control checkpoint, is using the photo to identify this traveler, that incident, when they checked a bag, how many bags they checked, when they entered the airport, when they went through the security checkpoint, when they checked in for the flight. Each of those incidents is logged in a personally identified, geotagged, time-stamped log. And finally, most importantly of all, this log of incidents constructed through facial recognition checkpoints is one of the inputs that goes into the control system, which is in effect. And you hear people speak simplistically and mistakenly about a no-fly list. It's not a no-fly list. There's a list that's one of the rules in the algorithm, but what's actually happening is a real-time algorithmic decision-making and profiling process, which takes into account the entirety of the database associated with this identity. So when someone's photo is passed, it's not just that the photo is being matched to see which dossier to call up, but then once the dossier associated and identified with this photo is called up, that is dropped into the input hopper of an algorithmic black box that decides whether to allow the person to fly, not to allow them to fly, but after they get extra questioning, search them, make a federal air marshal sit next to them on the plane, any of a variety, call the police, any of a variety of outcomes can occur. So I think you need to look at the facial recognition as an identification tool, but not in isolation. It only makes sense in the context of this broader program of logging of movement, which is a surveillance system, and use of that for positive control, where airlines, at least in the US, and this is now under an EU directive being rolled out EU-wide, are required to install positive controls so that a boarding pass is not issued until they receive individualized permission from the government. And the default is no. This is already in effect in the US, already mandated by EU law. And I see the surprise on some faces there. Most people don't realize that this is happening. This is a big difference between a pure passive surveillance system, where there is this ongoing active control mechanism built in. So what is the significance here to using facial recognition in this process? The big thing is that it builds out the gallery of faces which can be used by the government in other contexts. The more images in different contexts they have of someone, the better chance they have of picking them out of a crowd in some other setting. And in addition, the facial recognition enables the use, and again, this gallery can be used in other contexts, not just the airport. But in other cases where you might pass by a camera, the government doesn't necessarily identify you. But the airport, where you have to show your passport anyway, at least for international flights, provides the opportunity to link these photos to an identity and build the back end of the system that can be used in other places. But of course, basing it on facial recognition enables a much more granular level of control. If you have to show your passport to identify yourself or your other identity documents, then you know that this is happening, and there's public resistance to having too many checkpoints on the streets or whatever. Whereas facial recognition enables more granular control at every stage of the journey and is intended to do so. And I would just, pass on to one other thing here. If we could go back to the those illustrations, the first of those photos showing the setup at the, this is actually from a DHS, recent DHS promotional video promoting this program. If we could go back, sorry about that. Yeah, okay, this is the setup at the latest generation of TSA, Transportation Security Administration airport entry checkpoint or security checkpoint. And you see the first, where they're boasting of their new biometric facial recognition identity check as touchless and therefore justified by the pandemic. And you see their own illustration shows that the first thing that happens when you show up is, instead of being able to show your passport, which you could do with your mask on, the first thing that happens is you have to remove your mask because the facial recognition doesn't work without it. And it's not just that they are requiring people in airports to risk their lives by removing their masks in order to deploy facial recognition. So it's not just that they're requiring people to risk their lives, but that they're trying to claim that somehow the pandemic justifies this as a touchless system. And it's not just that that's bankrupt and pretextual, but I think that this should be a red flag for us about the extent to which the pandemic is being used as a pretext for pre-existing surveillance and control agendas, and should really raise the fact that something that you have only to glance at this to see that this is not good pandemic practice. If you were trying to say, what technology would you deploy during the pandemic in a public space? Nothing is more strongly counterindicated than facial recognition that requires mask removal, right? It's clearly the worst case scenario. This is the worst time to be thinking of deploying it. The fact that it's being justified on this basis, again, I think shows how crises are being exploited to get us to accept a level of surveillance and control that we would not accept in other contexts.
Stefan, you've been working for many years in that space from sort of both sides of the barricades, as they might be called, but you arrived to the point that you feel you want to tell your story through the book that's coming next year, right?
I mean, it's not so much my story, because my story is really boring. It's just going to work like everybody else. What I wanted to tell more was just ways of thinking about technology ethics, which is a phrase that gets bandied about around, and yet most of us, unless we're French, are not actually trained in ethics as young people. And it's entirely possible to even go through a liberal arts education in many Western universities and never take a philosophy class. And yet this phrase is being used, and it's being discussed in terms of AI ethics, or the ethics of the body and biometrics, which obviously facial recognition is one of them. So I wanted to just, write a book that kind of looks at that would be for younger people who are beginners and starting out. I felt like I was a beginner and sometimes still do. So it's not for a specialist audience. It's going to be very general. And I've tried to draw on the scholarship of many people, some of whom I think are on this call. I see Joanna Bryson is on this call, and I have her ginormous Oxford Handbook of the Ethics of AI, which is only 958 pages. So that's taking me ages to get through, but so interesting. So what I'm looking at in terms of facial recognition is kind of like how I sort of am trying to channel the ordinary person who's saying, why, I love this question of airports because it's so practical. Why is it that none of us have been consulted about this? It's just being sort of rolled out and nobody's asking sort of why or how. And there's obviously a history to that. So I have nephews who are teenagers and 20 years old, respectively, who don't know what life is like before the internet and don't know what life was like before 9/11. They've never lived in this world that I have memories of, just because I'm so ancient and exhausted that, not everybody thought it was acceptable or even on the menu to be taking your body data and using it. And I even wanted to sort of play with that historically and culturally to say, as a woman, I'm very accustomed to society feeling it has access to my body or opinions about my body, or that it can police or shame my body. And I think that's probably quite a fair statement, I would reckon, of many people of color, where we do not have the same experiences when walking down the street. We don't have the same experiences when dealing with law enforcement. And then you build this technology on top of it, and it amplifies, etc. And this discussion of, you know, the machine is neutral. I couldn't, not that anybody on this call has mentioned that, but sometimes you'll get this idea that if it's tech, it's somehow more dispassionate. And that is where my background and experience has helped me to feel very confident in saying, you know, bullshit. Anything that you're putting into a machine is being put into by people. And again, this takes us back to this question of philosophy, that if you haven't studied philosophy, if you don't have the structural understanding of how philosophy works, it's a little bit harder maybe. You'll get there, but it'll take you longer and possibly be just a bit more painful or more inefficient to ask those questions of like epistemology. So, you know, what is it that we're trying to do? What is knowledge? How do we know? How do we know if a data set is biased or not? How do we understand an algorithm? How do we do algorithmic accountability and justice and reparations? Who is building it? Those cultural questions, for me, I didn't come from a technology background. I come from a humanities, arts, and social sciences background. So these are very familiar in philosophy and in science and technology and in human-computer interface, but I come from the human side. And so I wanted to create a book that's almost going to be more like a reference book, where there's a lot of pictures, because I'm a picture person, I have to draw stuff out, but where also those pictures are like handy clip-in saves, you know, so you can sort of take that into your meeting and just have it on your phone and never get sort of blown again by somebody who's trying to talk you through something. You can kind of use it to situate yourself and use them as problem-solving tools. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, is kind of a student who's also had to teach, and then handing over some knowledge in the hopes that it might be useful. If it's not, the book can sink like a stone, which I'm sure my publishers would be delighted to hear me say. That's fine. But I wanted to put it out there because I wish this book had existed when I was starting out in technology, because I often felt that I was being asked to look at problems without the the Swiss Army knife that I wish I had had, or the toolbox that I wish I had had. And so I've built this, and people can use it if it's useful or not. So facial recognition is going to be a big part of that, because I wanted to pick something that we all can understand. I don't think you have to be an expert in AI or even remotely technical to understand that if you give the police this kind of tool, even assuming that the police are excellent actors, which I do, by the way, in most cases, it's going to change. It's not a technical problem. Like, the technical problem, I think, is the easier one to solve. I'm interested in the social problem of how do we have a legal framework around this? You know, I live in the United Kingdom, where supposedly we're protected by the GDPR. My biometric data can't be taken up without my consent, except that I live in London, where facial recognition is used all the time. And to give an example of the lack of accountability about this, the Financial Times broke a story, I think in 2019, about facial recognition being used at London's King's Cross, which many people think is public property, but it's not. It's privately owned land, except that everybody's running around on it. People who work at Google, people who are coming to and fro on the Eurostar, people who go to The Guardian, including their journalistic sources, would all have been picked up by that tech. It was being rolled out for 22 months. They didn't have to put signs anywhere the way that you do with CCTV. They also have been investigated by the ICO, who apparently still doesn't know if that was legal or not. How on earth that could take that long, I have no idea, but we still haven't had a judgment. And meanwhile, the police have, you know, gotten the sort of smackdown from the case that they lost on the South Wales police use of this technology, and their response to that legal loss wasn't to say, oh, we're going to hold off on this tech. It's quite problematic. Maybe, you know, nobody seems to want this right now. Their response was, we're going to keep using facial recognition technology, so we will use this legal verdict to improve our practices so that we use it in such a way that if we're ever challenged in court again, we'll win. And yet, no debate in Parliament, no discussion. So that's the way that the book is looking at different kinds of technologies, is not from the sort of techie nerd standpoint. I don't think it's going to be any code or anything in the book at all. It's looking at it very much from you're just a person living in this world, but there's a context to that world, and that context is not accidental. It's created, and you have a part to play in creating it. So how can you do that?
There's an assumption underlying that question that we can, or at least we should, be able to distinguish. But I think one of the things that the airport example makes most clear is that normally you can't tell. You are checking in at the airport, and the facial recognition, this is actually the case already in the US, it's probably operated, in some of the installations, the cameras are operated by the airport as a common use facility provided to the airlines. So the camera might be operated by the airport, which is an entity of a state or local government, or it might be operated by the airline, or it might be that it's actually provided by DHS. And the data goes into a database which is used by airlines and is designed to enable global interoperability. And that was the other diagram that we skipped over quickly earlier, the global cloud of reservation data, in which not only the airlines, but the airport operators and governments around the world all have root access. So that even if you're flying within Europe, the office in China of that reservation system or that airline or the government that comes to that office in China can retrieve your reservations and the photo that you put in your profile for that flight within Europe. So there's no, the system was not built in a way that was designed to, or that does enable people to make these kind of granular distinctions, or even to know whether they're allowing their face or other data to be used by the government or by industry, or where in the world or which governments. It's all or nothing at this point if you want to fly at all. And that's the way it was designed to be, all or nothing.
There's a couple of questions from Gus. Can you hear me, Gus? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So Stephen Oram is asking, can your system recognize that the same person is leaving and thank them for wearing a mask if they have kept it on?
That's an interesting question. Yes, indeed, it could. But right now it doesn't. It does thank people for wearing masks, and it does to ask people who aren't wearing masks to wear them. One interesting piece of early feedback was that the thanking wasn't actually needed because people were getting annoyed by the thank you message. And, you know, the idea is that it's not intrusive. It just is that little tiny nudge to make you think, oh yes, I'm supposed to be wearing a mask, right? And if it does that, it's achieving its purpose. So yes, could thank them on the way out. We could tie in, easily could hold an image for a short period of time. But again, that means holding an image, right? So I need to hold at least the metrics of an image, hold the metrics of an image to compare when someone enters and when someone leaves. And given GDPR and everything else, I just felt a bit uncomfortable about that. So it's just really literally a point in time.
And to follow up on that question, Gus, one more before we move to Satinder. How do you make it transparent to people whether or not the images are being stored? How would you handle it in your case to make it transparent?
We do it in a very simple way. On each unit, there's a QR code, which takes the user to our website, and the policy's on there. If they wanted to see the policy, anyone who's using the system knows that images aren't being stored and aren't being used for any other purpose. Literally, it's what happens is the camera sees a frame, it analyzes the frame, it determines the mask wearing or not mask wearing, and then dumps it straight away. It only ever resides in memory. It never resides in permanent storage.
Right, so the follow-up question to that, I think from Dan Stapleton would be, if you don't store the data, can you monitor it for bias should anybody want to choose it for, use it for identification? I guess you don't store it because in the context there is no identification, but if in a different case you would want to store it, I guess to provide transparency, you would have to have a record, a log of some sort.
Well, so the log really, all the log basically is time, date and time, and were they wearing a mask or weren't they wearing a mask? Right? And it's a count of those, right? So the important piece of information to get back for the owner of the space is, apart from the real-time notification of mask wearing or not mask wearing, is to see trends over time. So if you try something in your organization to increase mask wearing, how effective are you being at that, right? So if you bring in a new policy this week, how does that compare to the compliance of the previous 2 weeks? Is it actually effective? Because you don't want to just upset people. You know, if you bring a policy in, you need to prove that it's actually being beneficial, and so it aids an organization in being able to see that it's being productive.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. I think this is a question for Satinder, probably from Simon Sarginson. So, what ethical perspective or idea or construct is most thoroughly missing from the debate about facial recognition? So what ethical perspective, idea or construct are missing from the current framework of the tracking systems?
That's a good question, and a wide question. You know, in the journal, we speak about how, you know, the prediction paradigm is being offered to us, you know, facial recognition and other forms of tracking systems as somehow a dream of safety, national security, fraud detection, and disease control and diagnosis. And that needs some deep thinking about. I mean, the origins of these technologies come from within academia, and then they've spread out into the corporate world. And how one manages things within one context regarding ethical guidelines on how we do things, and once they go outside of that, it gets a lot more tricky. And you know, there was a recent report by the Coalition for Critical Technology 2020.
Oh yes.
So which, you know, their conclusion was there are discriminatory consequences of predicting criminality. I've noticed that people here are quite happy for the police to collect their data. And the, you know, the private companies that actually work with the police are able to sell on this data. So that has also consequences. You know, we are being commodified. So I actually want to, if I may, just digress very, very marginally, but related to this. Some beautiful work by Joy, I hope I pronounce her name right, do correct me, Bulamwin at MIT. Beautiful work on, a few years ago, she was doing a study and they decided to use facial recognition, but it didn't work for her and for the other darker skinned people in the group. So they had to use a light skinned person in order to train the system. And that led her on then to do a more systematic study. And what's astonishing about it, well, perhaps not so astonishing, is that the error rate was higher for females than for males and higher for darker skinned subjects than lighter skinned subjects. In fact, of 3 of the systems that they analyzed, the error rates were for darker skinned women were 20.8% and 34.5% and 34.7%. But for 2 of them, for 2 of the systems, the error rates went up to 46.5% and 46.8% for very dark skinned women. So her conclusion was that, well, you know, you could have been guessing your gender and at random and who you are, your identity. So that is a very serious issue and a quite problematic issue. And the other one is that, you know, this, it's a slippery slope to then say, okay, we now recognize your face and now we are going to look at your emotions. And then you start getting into a behavioral economy and behavioral governance. So in the case of China, you know, it's a tricky area. You know, people will become self-conscious about how they should be behaving. So there's a danger in making outsiders of people, and one needs to be very critically conscious of what you mean by a norm. What is the norm? And in, you know, it transgresses into other forms of surveillance. So now the police are thinking of looking at gait of people. There are all sorts of issues that then arise from that.
Yes, I'm going to bring John in a minute. Just one more launch of the poll. So would you go for points to AI bar with facial recognition? Yes, no, only if they delete faces every hour, or depends on the beer they sell? So you have choice, yes, no, only if they delete faces, depends on the beer they sell. I mean, there is an argument that it does improve quality of queuing on Friday night, particularly as a woman, you're always elbowed out. But I'm not making a case for it. I'm just interested what you guys think. Okay, so I think we got the answers. So let me share. Right, so only if they delete faces every hour. So Gus, I think that goes towards your framing of the usefulness and the balance between retail convenience and what needs to happen. Are you still there, or is your lovely dog?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I'm still here. My lovely dog is representing me. I'm halfway through a gin and tonic, so I didn't want to get everyone, you know, chomping at the bit. So I didn't want to make everyone jealous.
So on the technical question, Gus, so if people were comfortable if you delete faces every hour and if the bar deletes faces every hour, would you be able to provide some kind of dashboard or you know, evidence to whoever wants to inquire if that's indeed the case? Because it's all about trust, isn't it? We're all circling around the fact that nobody trusts anything, and anything that smells of tech is, you know, subverted because it's usually obnoxious. So how do we rebuild the bloody thing, you know, because we are all technologists, we build stuff. So how do we build it right? So question to you, how could you show, not obviously to everybody, but whoever wanted to inquire, is there a way of showing that you do delete and it doesn't go to the cloud and it doesn't end up in Stephanie's previous boss, Peter Thiel and Palantir?
It's incredibly hard, and it has to be done on faith. I mean, there is no silver bullet way of ensuring that that's the case, right? You know, you have a policy and you state your policy. I think that legally, if you state that you're operating under a certain policy and it's later found that you're not, then you should be liable for that. And I think as technologists in this space, we should automatically try to hold the data for as short a time as possible. That should be our going in position, right? Because out of respect for the people that appear and we look at, and it's not just images, remember, it's other data as well. So this can be audio data, it can be numeric data. You know, AI is used in many, many different areas. And I think as a technologist, if our going in position is to persist the data only for the period of time that it's needed to perform the function that the unit is doing, right? And that can be explained. So where I think I'm getting to is that as a provider of a service, you almost have an obligation to the people that are going to interact with that service to only use their personal information and data to achieve the purpose that your device is there to provide. As soon as you go beyond that, you're doing something wrong.
Right, okay, fair enough. That's an honest answer. So following on that, a question from Derek Alton. Derek is Canadian, and he has been quite closely involved through family ties, but I'm not saying anything, with some of the smart city adventures. But the question is, what about facial recognition collection being used as an enabler for deep fakes? I guess that's a Gus question.
Software is getting better at detecting deep fakes. there was an interesting thing, a story about 2 or 3 years ago, which came out around facial recognition, that there was a group of guys at MIT who found an algorithm that would ostensibly change your facial image so it couldn't be recognized and tied to you. Now, if you look at two images side by side, they looked identical, but there were very subtle changes in the image that would fool most facial recognition systems for saying this person is the same as that person, right? I think if something like that something like that can be developed, then something for developing those subtle changes or identifying those subtle changes to images that are used for deep fakes could be engineered. But that would be an AI solution in and of itself, right? Looking at an image or a video and determining whether it was fake or not, right? I think certainly social media organizations almost have an obligation to be developing that technology if it doesn't already exist. And that's actually not a bad idea.
I just wanted to say though about this thing, these two things that Gus brought together. It's super interesting how different they are. Okay, so yes, it is actually, machine learning is pretty easy to spot deep fakes. That is, I've heard that from, I don't do a lot of deep learning myself, but I was hanging out on a panel with Jan LeCun, and he was telling me about how that's easy, and people think it's going to be hard, but when you do it systematically, of course, it's easy to detect the systematicity. Whereas when we happened to be talking was right after the Christchurch shootings, and it's much, much harder to figure out, even with regular normal video, whether if you just take a smidgen out of it, then all of a sudden it's not recognizable by automatic means, quick automatic means. And so he was just talking about the contrast of those two cases. But I want to come to this thing about the technology that allows you to sort of hide yourself with these slight masks. And you made all, so yeah, I don't know if MIT did that. I do know CMU did this thing where you put like glasses on and then they think you're, you know, Brad Pitt or something. And I was just like, yeah, this is rubbish. You know, like it's obviously just somebody faking. Yeah, not these, they're like really weird glasses, but nevertheless, it's like, this is just, you know, people making this up. It's like, oh, random noise. There's no way this actually makes, you know, makes you look like, you know, Brad Pitt, except for one stupid algorithm that only knows 100 people or something.
We have them. Ben, I think you can pull out to illustrate Joanna's point. I think we have a couple of images with the DAZZLE clap. You know, there is
the DAZZLE things.
The DAZZLE.
Okay, so it turns out it's way more interesting than what so I thought they were only doing hype. Of course, it's a bit of hype. It's not random noise. Somebody has carefully figured out the difference between you and in fact, any person in Brad Pitt, apparently. But what's really interesting is that for all these different kinds, oh yeah, this is just the DAZZLE stuff. No, but I'm talking about the specific glasses that make you look like Brad Pitt. The point is that for a huge category of machine learning, if you can make like a car look like an ostrich or you know, or most people look like Brad Pitt, I bet there's racial differences there. But anyway, you know, so whatever, for some candidate, a subset of people that just put on these glasses and look like Brad Pitt. It turns out that that doesn't just apply to a single training event. So there's something fundamental about how these machine learning algorithms are working, that doing stuff that to a human looks like random noise does actually generate all this information, which is inseparable from Brad Pitt, or not just Brad Pitt. You know, you choose your image that you're trying to make it look like. So I was astounded by that, and it probably tells us something fundamental about vision. Yeah, there we go. Those are the kinds of glasses. Yeah. Okay. So it doesn't look like much is going on. It could be just op art, you know, but no, there's actually like that information has been captured and transmitted through these artifacts that makes you look like another person. Yeah. So yeah, that stuff is super weird. But I want to come back to the more general questions that you were asking about, like, what can we possibly do about this? And I was asking about, like, you, someone who's really thought about it, care about ethics. How do you try to convince people? Gus again. Sorry to keep picking on Gus about the artifact. And there are, yes, to some extent, it's about faith, right? So you have to have some trusted source, unless you yourself. And yeah, if you work for like technology review, you get people to send you the object and you take it apart yourself. and you try to look and see, is it anywhere, and you work with some smart friends, and hopefully you've got a lot of background yourself. But for most of us, we have to say, okay, when technology review does that, do we believe technology review or not, right? Do we trust the experts they brought in? And so, yeah, at the end of the day, this is coming down to grounding in experts. And to some extent, that means we're just where we were 100 years ago, or maybe where we've always been, about like, how do you know whether a picture is faked or not? Basically about, you trust that, you know, whatever newspaper actually would have checked, and the odds of them being fooled are small because they know the kinds of problems. Again, you're trusting expertise.
That is really the core point in a way. So if I can bring Derek for a second, you know, the whole conversation in Toronto at the moment, which seems to be the place where facial recognition has hit the public probably most, when it turned up that artificial intelligence facial recognition cameras were in a number of malls without anybody knowing about them. So Toronto is now finding itself in the eye of the storm. So Derek, you work with the governmental technology in the process of building trust. So how do you even go about rebuilding trust after something like that is allowed to happen?
Really easy question, thank you.
You're the trust builder, so come on.
Yeah, well, yeah. So yes, Toronto has definitely been in the eye of the storm, both with the recent developments around discovering AI being used by a bunch of malls. And it wasn't just in Toronto, that was a mall network across Canada that was doing this, but also Sidewalk Labs happening there, which was the Google's project to do some urban developments in downtown Toronto on the shore there, with all sorts of different ideas. But to your question around how do you build trust in tech as government, I mean, it's really hard, but I think there are two key aspects that help build trust from the perspective of government. One is something that the private sector does really well, which is like, you prove it through doing good stuff. So you build tech that makes people's lives easier, that makes their lives more enjoyable or helps them with something. If your tech works and is easy for them to use, that builds a sense of trust in what you're doing. Not saying the government has not the best track record at, but that's one way of doing it. Another way is you give people more control over their experience. And so when people feel like they have more control, it allows them to trust what's happening more because they have that sense of agency. A third way you could do it is also to associate the tech with things that people trust, whether it is family members or people that they identify as like them, or celebrities that they're attached to, or just you basically connect your tech with someone they trust, and the trust transfers to the tech. Those are sort of three approaches I can think of off the top of my head that can be used to build trust. I wouldn't say we in government are the best at using any of those, but those are things that I think can help build trust in tech.
Okay, I will come back to Joanna, but can I just ask a question on the poll if I can find it? Right, the AI, it's very easy at the moment, and Gus was showing me how he was training it. So have you guys trained AI image recognition to tell the difference between a fox and a bear? Yes, of course, not yet, no, but I will soon. I have better things to do. So have you tried to train the model? Because it's insane how easy it is. It still needs a bit of tech, but it's certainly not a tech challenge anymore. So the question is, this stuff is now going out and it will be available to a lot of people. So a lot of products will be built, good and bad. But a lot of people I ask for should know about it, don't really know much about it. So let me just share the poll. Okay, so I have better things to do, so no, but quite a few people not yet. And I encourage you to do that because it's a very interesting exercise. So Gus, do you want to say a couple of words on your fox and bear adventures?
Yeah, sure. You hit the nail on the head. it is fundamentally easy, right? And I think there's the analogy is bio research, right? Genetics used to be the realm of people in very long and very clean white coats. Yet now you can create an organism that has no ancestors. And there are clubs in America and in the UK where people will practice with this, right? So once this technology becomes available to the masses at no cost and almost on a club type basis, things are going to happen and things are going to be done that you didn't expect. And none of us really know what the true impact of all this is going to be. It is now so easy to do. I mean, literally doing this took 2, possibly 3 days at a push, right? So it's that simple. The hardest bit, quite frankly, is getting enough training data together and ensuring that your training data is unbiased, or as well as you can to make sure the training data is unbiased. So, you know, finding, you know, bears, or what is a bear? You know, there are certain little pandas that are classed as bears, but I don't actually think they're bears. They're not big and they're not got claws and big teeth, you know, but they're still called bears. So, you know, do you want those? Don't you want those? It's an interesting thing. And I would urge anybody who hasn't yet got involved in producing an AI model, even if you don't actually do it, just look at the steps. The steps are very simple. You find a bunch of data. You can either classify the data or detect, right? These are the two primary ways of looking at it. You can take a picture and say, what is there in this picture that I recognize, which is classification, right? And then you've got detection, where you're looking for something specific, and is that very specific thing there or is it not there? Yeah. The workflow for both is very similar. The models for them are slightly different, but the process is fundamentally simple. You know, it's not, you certainly don't need to be a rocket scientist to do this. Anyone with an interest can do it.
Following up from that, there were a few questions about, can facial recognition algorithm recognize people underneath the mask? And is the individual specification above the mask, or is it the jawline, as Simon is pointing? Do we know that?
Artificial intelligence doesn't care about eyes, noses, mouths. The algorithm actually it's a matrix. It works on matrices, and it looks for similar patterns within matrices. And for images, those matrices are formed around pixels. For numerical data and audio data, they use different metrics. So it doesn't it doesn't know about eyes, it doesn't know about noses, it doesn't know about ears, it doesn't know any of that. All it knows is that you've given me 30,000 images, and mathematically the similarity between these 30,000 images is what I'm going to use as my model for now, looking at other things that fall into this category. So it doesn't matter. If you had, I think the image of recognizing someone who's wearing a mask, I think you'd have to do that based around the eyes, I suppose. But you know, the technical challenge there is finding a camera that is of high enough resolution, where the lighting was good enough and continually reliable. But mathematically, could it be done? Of course it could.
So I just wanted to bring Wendy on that. You talk a lot about passive surveillance and the fact that we can't opt in to that. What are your thoughts on that element of building trust that is not there because we can't opt in? Do you think there's a way of building it in a different way? What would be your take?
I mean, lots of people talk about passive surveillance. It sort of came up after the Snowden revelations. I went to a meeting of, you know, high-level techies who were trying to figure out how to make it harder for security services to monitor everything. You know, if you can raise the cost of it, they can't do it in quite such bulk. But what Edward's talking about is, you know, is happening without any consent at all. And once you want to fly somewhere and you've bought your ticket and you've made the commitment to go, it's very hard, you know, it's very hard to get around the airport system, because, you know, the guy's going to yell at you and throw you off the plane or you can do what he says. You're going to do what he says most of the time. There are very few of us. I mean, I'm the only person I ever see at airports opting out of the scan, you know. So, I mean, the thing that I wonder about is, you know, GDPR was an effort to try to control what was done with our data online, but it's obviously inadequate. The permission-based approach is obviously inadequate in the physical world. You know, we'd have to have a little gate on every street. You know, if you go down this street, you are consenting to having your biometrics recorded, and do you consent? And you'd have to stand, you know, you'd have to unlock a gate, you know. I mean, it's not obviously not practical. So how could we create consent mechanisms? You know, how do we? That would really be my question: is how do we turn this back? How do we make them ask us for permission, and how do we make them pay attention when we say no?
There's another way potentially to view this. Yes, one approach is to ask permission, and technically that is very difficult to do. The second is, if you think about it, there are three things of concern, three primary things of concern. What data are you storing? What are you doing with that data? And thirdly, are you passing it on to any third party, right? If you had a policy around those three simple things and you said, okay, we are doing facial, in this area of town, we're doing facial recognition, and this is what our policy is. You then have the right to, you know, you either accept it or you don't, right? And I think post-fact, if organization A says, okay, we're only keeping the images in memory and we're getting rid of them, we're not passing them on to any third parties, blah, blah, blah. They have their policy. If they're found to be operating outside of that stated policy, then I think as society, we need to jump on them very, very heavily, right?
See, I would not find that a satisfying solution. And the reason is that it's one thing to be excluded from a website because you don't agree with their policy, but it's quite another for a public space. I mean, we are the owners of our cities. It is quite another for a portion of a public space to refuse you admission because they want to conduct a business practice that you disapprove of. You know, having exclusion zones on that sort of basis seems to be entirely contrary to what cities are supposed to be for.
Maybe we rely on good old democracy. You know, if the proposal is, it becomes like planning. You know, to do something in a city, you have that has to go through planning approval, and it has to get the approval of the people who occupy that space. It may be just as simple as being a planning issue. Do we accept this in our environment?
Well, this goes back to what Stephanie was saying before about King's Cross, though, that we don't necessarily always know everything that they're doing.
Well, King's Cross is a great example because it was done by the private developer that was operating King's Cross, and lots of people didn't even realize that King's Cross was being operated by a private developer, and they went off and basically created a surveillance zone without bothering to consult anyone, not even the police.
Stephanie told us about that before, earlier this evening.
Yeah, I was here.
Yeah, it's a good, at this point, actually, I just want to bring quickly Richard, because he has got, Richard Baybrook from Westminster University. He has got Chinese students, and we had various conversations with them, and their concept of that public space in the city is very different, but they also live in the place which produces all the vendors are from there. So Richard, do you want to quickly comment, but quickly, because we're running out of time, on the differences between China versus Europe versus US on the whole framing of facial recognition? You unmute.
Ah, there we are. Well, I'm not an expert on China. It was just interesting having conversations with them. I mean, the key difference always, the takeaway, not just with Chinese but other East Asians, is they trust their governments. That's the key thing. So, you can see this during the pandemic, the fact that they had a massive level of surveillance to suppress the virus seems to justify this to them. I have friends in Bangkok he's actually English, but he said they call COVID-19 the white man's virus because we lack the social self-discipline to get rid of it. And part of that is to do with this acceptance of giving up some of our individual rights when it's necessary. It's interesting here, it's seen as a, the discussion, I'm aware of this because I share a lot of this. We tend to frame it as between a sort of individual rights, libertarian approach, even on the left, and some sort of authoritarian state or corporation. Where it's interesting, where you could think that actually part of it is we have a difficulty how to think of democratic collective governance, or governments that are responsible or are accountable. And that is something I think is quite interesting, because the recent crisis in the last 8-9 months has shown that, because countries which distrust the state or big collective have done really badly. You know, tens, hundreds of thousands in the case of America have died because people won't collectively discipline themselves, trust collective institutions to do that, maybe for good reason, actually. But so I think that one of the things we need to think about is not just our own individual rights to our own facial, you know, and other biometric information, but actually if there are benefits to having a collective use of this, you know, to create the smart city or the intelligent environment, whatever we call it, is how do we have some form of accountability that's real? Because the difficulty is these bodies, as people have just been discussing, like whether it's King's Cross or Airport, it's pretty opaque who really controls them. And 40 years of neoliberalism has removed what democratic accountability that there was. And they've, you know, by the time you've gone through 20 shell companies, who actually control King's Cross, we don't know. Yeah, I think that's the problem partly, is if we're going to have, if we are going to have this particular systems, and I think there are big arguments why this is very good. You know, if you want to, you know, to save the environment, stop pandemics, I mean, let alone loony jihadis, you can see the advantages of it. The difficulty is how can you have a governance system that we can trust and that we have some control and accountability?
Yeah, I think John on the chat is making a good point. If you make something mandatory, then eventually trust increases, which is odd, but something that Shoshana Zuboff noticed about the machines. I brought
the same in China. It's interesting that when at the beginning of the pandemic, they had all these shock horror videos of people being nailed into their flats or taken off by people in noddy outfits. They didn't say that actually they were taking it from Chinese state television, because they were putting it on TV and saying this is what happens if you don't behave yourself. And huge percentage of the population, like here, you know, even now they're going on, you know, you have a very loud minority against lockdown. All the opinion polls show that the population think we're not doing it harsh enough. And I think that shows the difficulty that we're in here, that we instinctively, as I said, I share this. I've had my phone tapped by the secret police, so I'm fully aware of the dangers of these technologies. But I think the problem is we have to actually have some argument about how they can be collectively governed. Because if we just stick to the, you know, it's individual privacy, it's a losing battle, because the advantages of it are so great that it'll just be occupied by these bad actors.
I just wanted to, before we go back to the final round on trust and closure, you are a sci-fi writer and a sci-fi historian. Is there anything in sci-fi that can guide us in how we can negotiate that space and develop trusts? Or do we have to start from scratch?
One of the things that I was thinking around was both what Stephanie was talking about and what Derek was talking about, the sort of trust and ethics. And obviously that's where good sci-fi sort of can sit. You can be, I don't know whether it's lazy or dramatic or whatever, and just focus on dystopia and just focus on the negative. But sci-fi does have that ability to pose questions, and you know, some sci-fi does that far better than others, to pose questions, to put sort of alternatives forward. Yeah, some of the Ursula Le Guin stuff and things like that is good around that. But I was just wondering and I do some work with scientists and tech people where we work together writing fiction based on what they're working on, and I think that for me that works really well, because at the end of that process they have a veto on the story if the story doesn't portray the tech or the science properly, and we have to share a stage in front of a public audience. And you know, one bunch I worked with was saying, if your story is Terminator, we're not turning up. If it's Black Mirror, that's okay. And I was just wondering what people's views were on using sci-fi in that way to pose questions, not to be sort of super tech promoting, but also not to be super sort of tech doom and gloom, and whether that can help build trust, and does that help people to explore ethics, the ethics around these things through stories that are sort of ambiguous in terms of where they fall, and you make your mind up through the characters and the situation.
I think that would be a very good question for Satinder. So we can do the closing bits on trust, but I think that's one for you, Sat.
Oh gosh, big responsibility. I think that's, I'm really interested in that. I'd love to know more. So please do tell us when you have the next public event. Yeah, definitely. One mustn't be all doom and gloom. There's so many exciting possibilities of what we can do with technology. And having narratives are a very powerful way to engage our imagination and understanding, and allowing us to have this sort of ambiguity of contingencies, etc.
Like, to make a very long story relatively short, we have a paper coming out in December 11th, hopefully, in Science Advances. It's well known that inequality and polarization are very well correlated, and we think we understand why. They're not perfectly correlated, and actually China is one of the interesting exceptions, and actually Germany too, because it turns out that the real problem of inequality is mostly the false scarcities, because the small number of people get most things, and what really causes polarization, if we're right, again, it was science as usual, is when most people are experiencing economic decline. And so then they have a concern that things are falling apart, and so they start limiting their risk, and they start restricting the number of people they'll cooperate with or believe in. So I think there's all kinds of efforts that people are making about how can we build trust again, people talking to each other and everything. If we don't address the fundamental economic problems, and this comes back to these big questions about good governance, if we don't get back to doing reasonable levels of redistribution and creating a transparently secure society, then we are not going to fix polarization. Now, once we have done all those things, we won't immediately get trust back, and so then the bridge building stuff might actually help. But right now, I think the most important thing is to attack the fundamentals. So some of the things that people have brought up with, like the digital tax, which I don't like that word, I think it's transnational tax, but making sure that money comes out of these gigantic market cap companies, and we get back into a better regulated space, and that we start doing more reasonable level of redistribution than we have been. That social mobility is one of the things that builds trust. When you know someone who knows someone who works for those companies, right? And when you're fragmenting society so much, when people really don't have a shot at going somewhere, then why should they trust? So I think with artificial intelligence, we can increase transparency, and that's one of the great things about it. So that is a positive outcome. But I also think that if you look at how people have been using it, when they, again, in these underregulated spaces, when they use it haphazardly, they make mistakes that hurt their own businesses, which limits the freedom of people even to express themselves. You know, they create stupid little interfaces that you have to poke buttons on, and you can't communicate your needs to the company that wants to serve you. It's insane. I do think that, however, like Wendy was saying, other people have been saying, we're not going to go back, and we can't, to some extent, we can't really know that no one is keeping our personal data or whatever. And so I think we actually have to be proactive. And this is actually, when I first wrote, that was something I wanted to say badly a while ago, when you were talking about putting the mask on and whether you could recognize people from their eyes. Look, you can recognize people from their gaits, right? You can recognize people from voices. There's all kinds of things you could recognize people from. And I remember when Twitter, actually it was Twitter, when Twitter started coming up in your Google searches. And I thought, wow, now anyone can know what I'm thinking, because there wasn't even this fake privacy of Facebook. And I realized either I stop talking now or I start working on governance. You know, I start putting more effort into making sure I can live in this world and be who I am, because I'm an outlier. I know that. And so I think that's why we can't solve these problems totally independently. And one of the things we will have to do is proactively build systems to recognize when our data has been used against us. So to recognize unfair prediction and things like that, because no, it can't be entirely untrust. It has to be transparent, accountable systems, and we have to work hard on it.
Thinking about, if anything, I love this phrase, I wrote it down, that we can't go back. I trained as an historian, so I'm like, I'm constantly going back in my mind and thinking about this broader philosophical and narrative question of like, if we can't go back, well, what can we do, right? Like I love that as a sort of challenge, because we've talked about a lot of biometrics. Joanna's just hinted at that. It's not just face, it's voice, it's your DNA, it's your family decides somebody wants to find out if you're related to Vikings, and then everybody's stuff is being uploaded into the ancestry.com and being used by the police. And your consent was not asked for, you can't delete it, you don't know who's using it. If it's given to a company that's then sold on to another company, you have no control. So there's this question of control, which I think is really in the zeitgeist at the moment, and ownership, which is the capitalist model versus the human rights model. So I guess I would love to just see us kind of step back. The weird thing that technologists do, where they sort of rush to the tech and nobody steps back. I just want to know whose job it is. It used to be my job when I worked in various places, to be the person who stepped back and was like, do we need to build this? Because sometimes it's not that you can't go back, but you can say no. Or you can set the terms, and I'm grateful to this conversation because it's going to make me go back and do some more thinking. So that's my insight, is thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think, this is very, very interesting, because I'm Polish, and when I was growing up, I can tell you, there was no public sense of space, because everywhere were communist eyes, and you don't need artificial intelligence and camera to make you feel pretty damn uncomfortable. So the tech is a little bit spurious, but I think that I really was intrigued by Richard's students who were saying that, the Chinese students were happy when the income went up and their rights were considered as socioeconomic rights to income go up, as opposed to the dignity and the privacy that we relate to human rights. So, but they are producing the tech. The vendors produce the tech, which we have in King's Cross. So, we have to kind of put our arms around it, which is why we're trying to run these events, because we actually ran an event on apps very recently when it all started going pear-shaped. But that was just incompetence on ignorance mixed with corruption. So that was just failed from the beginning. But if you answer your question, how can you monitor the self-isolation? You could have plenty of AI solving that, but would we really want to be doing that? Would we want a Chinese-style camera at every gate of people who are diagnosed self-positive? Big question. So I think more events to come, but just to bring Edward and Wendy and Derek at the end. So a couple of sentences from each of you before we wrap up.
Well, I want to go back briefly to the question of trust. I think there are it's important to distinguish two different things that we want to have trust in, both in terms of accuracy. One is the accuracy of the algorithms in matching identities to faces. And the second, really quite independent, is the accuracy of the algorithms in matching identities to actions that are taken on the basis of them. And I think those have been munged together. But in terms, and it's really the actions, the pre-crime algorithms that are more important. But in terms of trust, it may be, technologists may be resistant to appeals to law or policy, but we actually have some established methods in the policy space for establishing trust. There's some technological enablers like immutable logs and algorithmic transparency, but we also have things like independent audits and judicial review are how you get trust, and knowing that something is subject to those. And a big problem is that facial recognition has already been deployed in ways that avoid all of these things, whether it's under a 9/11 exception or an airport exception or a pandemic exception. I was the plaintiff in a test case in the US seeking access to the mirror copies of airline reservations and travel data kept by DHS, in response to which the DHS retroactively exempted the whole database from the subject access provisions of the US Privacy Act. I've had a complaint pending for 3 years with the European Commission over the promiscuous global sharing with no access logs of the same data by the commercial reservations hosting providers. 3 years and the European Commission hasn't even begun to investigate that. So I think we really need to push for, and technologists, I think, have to be among those to recognize and to appeal to the public to recognize that technology cannot solve the problems of political accountability to the citizenry. Technology can't create a democratic mandate. That has to come from something outside of the technology.
Great. Yeah. On this point, I think, Derek, do you want to comment from your Canadian perspective? Because you guys quite sort of hopeful and, you know, always slightly Pollyanna about the ability of government to solve problems, and life will be better with a bit more tech and good government. So over to you.
Well, yeah, I guess, I mean, so for those who don't know, my day job is working for the government of Canada, working on trying to figure out how do we build the digital trust infrastructure for Canadian society. Very simple, easy job. I mean, one of the things for me is like, if we don't trust, and so government, my view on government is government's supposed to be this institute, this body that we've come together. It represents the collective will and desire of people, and we pool our resources into collective projects through government. So if we don't trust in government, then who do we trust in? Do we trust in ourselves? Do we trust in the private sector? Like, we have to trust in something. I mean, I will be first to admit the government's fundamentally broken, which is why I'm trying to fix it from within. One of the things that we're thinking a lot about where I'm at now is really around the incentives that build out ecosystems. So we talk about, you know, facial recognition. What are the incentives that is driving the use of facial recognition? And are there ways that we can tweak or change those incentives to have it go in the direction that we want, and have the values baked into the business models behind that are behind driving the use of facial recognition? I definitely resonate with Joanna's point about governance. And for me, it really brings some questions around power. You know, Stephanie made a point earlier about the importance of social sciences and the questions we bring. One of the big things for me is this question around power. I don't think we ask it enough about who has power, how is power impacted by these technological advances? Is it shifting the way power plays out, stuff like that. So I think these are questions that we fundamentally need to ask. And also the question, like, what are the important questions that we should ask, or the important problems that we should really be putting our energy into? I think is a really interesting question. So Stephanie, thank you for that one as well. And I think I'll end there.
Right. Okay. Well, good luck, Derek. You are the only one with semi-decent government. So, so we're hoping that you can show the way, because, you know, we still have to get rid of the ones we've got. Wendy, do you want to?
Hey, I'm resident of Germany here.
Sure.
Well, I was actually going to say that one of the big problems we face is that we have demonstrably untrustworthy leaders, certainly in the US and the UK, that may change. I imagine in the US soon, we will be all complaining about Biden, but the good thing is there'll be normal complaints instead of tearing our hair out, this guy is insane complaints. And I'm really looking forward to that. There was a great tweet on Twitter a couple of days ago where somebody said, I have no idea what Joe Biden is thinking about or what he's watching on TV right now, and it feels wonderful. Which seems to me to sum it up. And at least he was in politics long enough to remember what the norms were so he can observe them. But the thing I was going to say about inequality, I think Joe has really hit on something important there. In 1998, I went to a conference called the Virtual Democracy Conference, and I wrote it up for the Telegraph, and I have the write-up, and I can post a link to it later if anybody's interested. But one of the things, these were the world top class diplomats trying to figure out how the internet was going to affect them and how to sort of conduct business in the face of the internet. And I think it was Madeleine Albright who, I think she was the one who was there and said that the biggest impact they were facing at the moment was from CNN, because you couldn't tell a different story to the home crowd and the foreign leaders anymore.
Very, very interesting discussion. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts. Gus had to go, but he says he hopes he's managed to persuade you to go and play with AI, so at least you can assess the risk. And he is happy to do online lessons on telling the difference between the fox and the bear.
Thanks so much for having me. That was such a cool part of this panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, guys. And I'm sure we will follow up. Oh, sorry, Satinder, you want to...
Just very, very quickly, do check out the journal, AI in Society. And we welcome submissions. Joanna's one of our associate editors. So please do, submit papers, articles, etc., and check it out.
We will share the links on the blog, and we'll share also the text, because there's loads of very useful links there.
At some point, we're going to write the second iteration of the Digital Democracy Manifesto. We should input some of these ideas into it.
Absolutely. So we have a meeting in a couple of weeks' time on digital democracy, or rather what's wrong with it, and trying to make it better, which is somehow part of the discussion on the trust and government. So, you know, all you guys are very welcome to that. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you, the audience, for brilliant questions, and we will reconvene in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Night, folks.